Hi folks, this is another tutorial, a third part in a series if you like for phase 3, with regards to an explanation of the Excel Marksheet versus the SAMS Marksheet for English Home Language Grade 9 in particular. I have done two. As I say, this is essentially a third part in this particular mini-series, if you like. Let's get my video manual so you can see the previous two are done. One's on grade 7, one's on grade 8. Excuse me. So a lot of it has actually been covered already, and I would advise, as I've mentioned in my previous tutorials, for you to watch those ones as well, even if I say they aren't seemingly relevant. So in other words, if you're a high school and you don't have grade 7, I would still watch the grade 7 one, and vice versa. If you're a primary school and you obviously don't have grade 8 and 9, watch them just for possibly a more in-depth understanding. So the essential difference in the grade 9 marksheet compared to the grade 8 and the grade 7 marksheets, as discussed in the previous tutorials, is that when you look at this section here, the P1 oral, which as mentioned before is basically a little mini calculation patch, if you like, or section should I say, that generates a mark that gets dumped into this first activity column in task 3. Now in the grade 7 situation, and sorry, just to go back slightly, that this is actually weighted naught, which shows you that it's not a task in terms of being part of the overall term 2 calculation. As you can see, there's 3 tasks that form part of the calculation, and they are this one here, where the mark gets converted to a mark out of 30, this one here where the mark gets converted to a mark out of 30, and this one here where the mark gets converted to a mark out of 40. Now this section, as I was saying, creates this mark here. In the grade 7 scenario, this mark here is actually weighted naught. So what that means, and not only is that weighted naught, but the oral 1 is weighted naught. So what that means is that, firstly, this calculation patch, if you like, only uses the term 2 oral section. Okay, so the mark that finally gets converted for this section only comes for oral 2. And what is more is that the mark that gets dumped into this P1 oral section is also weighted naught. So what it's saying is, we don't want to use this combination mark at all, but they basically have it there because in the grade 8 section they will use it in a slightly different manner. In the grade 9 section they use it completely, and I'll get to that now. So in the grade 8 section, you see that in this calculation area for task P1, which is a combination of oral 1 and oral 2, oral term 1 and oral term 2, as discussed previously, in the grade 8 section they do use this P1 oral mark as part of the third task in this whole area. Okay, but they don't consider oral 1. Okay, they only consider oral 2. So in other words, oral 2 counts as one of the 3 tasks within this section, as well as 30% of the third task within this section. So only oral 2 counts, because as I said, they make oral 1 weighted naught. Okay, and you can see those in the previous tutorials. You can see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, just giving you a little bit of background there, because the difference here in the grade 9 section is that they do in fact use the first term oral mark as part of this mini calculation, if you like, called task P1, that gets dumped into this section here as one of the activities and counts ultimately 30% of the third task. So in other words, this mark here, this 19, is made up of term 1 and term 2 oral, whereas in the grade 8s it's only made up of term 2 oral, and in the grade 7s doesn't even count at all. I would argue grade 7 kind of in the sense is the more traditional way of calculating things, because in the grade 7 method all it's actually doing is counting the oral 2 mark once and the rest of the marks accordingly. Anyway, so, and again I'm going to make another tutorial in each of these 3 sections showing you how I build the formula, and that's going to make things clearer as well, and you can see how we deal with this section. But in this particular tutorial, these tutorials are with regards to just simply looking at how it matches up to the Excel spreadsheet, the ones that you produce by batch in FrontOFFICE, and which are very useful as discussed before, because they can be stored in the cloud and produced by batch and handed out to the teachers, and of course being in Excel are far easier to understand and very transportable in terms of being used on any platform you like, and of course also are imported via our sync process and populate SAMs, and can be done by batch as well. So let's look at this quite simply. So you've got task 2 oral, okay, which is a mark out of 15 converted to a mark out of 30, and that's fairly straightforward. That's this column here, task 2 oral. Okay, there's no activities within this task. In other words, no yellow bits that accompany the pink bits, so to speak. So that's very simple. A mark is entered out of 15. The second task, task 2, let me just my sheet back up. The second section, task 2, again is very straightforward. It's its own task on its own. No activities within the task. It's a mark out of 20 and gets converted to a mark out of 30, right? 17 out of 20 converted to a mark out of 30. That's done in the formula itself. I'll give you a brief look at what that looks like, but as I say, we'll cover that in the next section. Then the only difference between the term for English Home Language grade 9, the difference between English Home Language grade 9 and grade 8 and grade 7 is that whereas in grade 8 and 7 we don't need to worry about the term 1 oral mark, because as I say it's weighted naught, so it doesn't actually come into the picture, and so these 3 columns tend to be grayed out or redded out, if you like. But in the case of grade 9s, it does count. And as I said, and I've mentioned this in previous tutorials, there's a kind of inconsistency in that sense, in that you have to make it count in one sense, but not in other areas. So unfortunately, there's no real way around this for now. Anyway, in the next cycle, you know, Carl and I will continue to build on all of these things like we've always done over the years. So there's no real way for now around the fact that you're going to have to look at your term 1 mark sheet and put the term 1 oral marks into this section. So in other words, if you go to the term 1 section, and of course you would be looking at your mark sheet, because you wouldn't be looking at SAMS itself, but you should have this information on your mark sheet. I'm just jumping back in the SAMS program itself for the sake of convenience and for the sake of the tutorial. Okay, so your marks are there in the term 1 oral. Now, the key factor here is that the mark in term 1 is out of 30, okay? And the mark in term 2 is converted to a mark out of 15, because they're obsessed with jumping between mark conversions. Sometimes a mark goes through the mill 3 or 4 times before it's kind of finalized in a sense, and again you'll see what I mean in the formula building tutorials, because there are a number of times we have to round off the mark, and it gets rounded off quite a few times in these mark conversion processes, and bits are added and lost all the time. But you know, we only work here. So this mark, okay, let's say is 21 out of 30, and as I say, has to be converted to a mark out of 15. Now, it's very important, as I mentioned in the previous tutorials, that we don't cling on to decimals when putting these marks into our mark sheets. Our mark sheets by default are set to not allow decimals into the field properties, but we do have cases where people keep separate mark sheets for their own amusement, or whoever knows. I guess there has been a bit of crossover involved in terms of what people are used to and what they're having to do now, and so they tend to copy and paste the marks across, and when you do that, the field properties in the Excel sheet come with it, and so then it suddenly allows decimals, and so you may find, and as I say, once it goes through to SAMS, the decimals are dropped because SAMS doesn't allow it in their front end, so you might start to find discrepancies between the records you're keeping personally and what is actually coming out in SAMS, and indeed what is calculated in front office, because if the decimal is going into the Excel mark sheet and ultimately into your report mark, then that is what will go onto the report in front office. So it's something just to be wary of. Now, okay, so you're pulling this mark, as I say, into this mark sheet as a mark out of 15, and you can see here, okay, a mark out of 30, and to convert to a mark out of 15, quite simply divide by 2 in this case. So it'll be easy to demonstrate to you. So 21 divided by 2 is obviously 10.5. So note that the mark has rounded up to 11, and indeed if you go to the Term 2 mark sheet in SAMS itself, you can see that the mark is indeed 11. So as I say, just make note of that. If you have your previous Term 1 mark sheet, it's quite easy to copy and paste the column from the Term 1 mark sheet, stick it into a separate sheet, paste it and do a little mark conversion with a round function, and it'll convert the mark for you. And also, folks, just on a side note, ignore the fact that I've got marks and stuff in here. As I say, this was just for as I was doing my calculations to see what would work and what wouldn't. So anyway, right, so you do pull in the Term 1 mark across. Now this second column here, right, the oral 2, and you can see this this task P1 oral 2, right, task P1 oral 2, we don't actually need, because we already have it. We already have it over here, and again I'll show you in the formula build how we fetch it. In this case it's quite convenient because the mark is originally out of 15 and it stays out of 15. Okay, so and then of course we therefore don't need this mark here, okay, to be entered again, because it's actually fetched from somewhere else. And we actually have both marks. We've got the Term 1 mark here and we've got the Term 2 mark here. So again, in the formula build, I can recreate that mark, so to speak. So the only marks that need to be entered are then these 3 marks over here. Okay, so your final 3 marks for the task 3, which you can see are these ones over here. So basically, in summary, just to recap, you're entering the task 2, the oral 2 mark for Term 2. Okay, the task 2 mark, which in this specific SAMS mark sheet doesn't actually seem to specify what it is, which is quite strange, particularly for languages where they're normally quite specific about what subtopic it is. But but again, I only work here, so there exists a mark for the second task in term 2, which is out of 20 and converted to a mark out of 30. Right, so you're entering a mark out of 20 there. Then what you're doing is you are entering your term 1 oral marks halved and rounded. Okay, quite simply. So take your mark out of 30, halve it and round it off, and put it into the task P1 column in here. Then you don't need to enter anything for this column, and you don't need to enter anything for this column. Okay, so in other words, you don't need to enter the second part of this task. You can see these are within the same task. If you look at my previous tutorials, I actually explain this in detail quite nicely as to how you can actually see how the tasks are grouped. In other words, that's a separate task number, that's a separate task number. They don't have activities within them. You can see this, they're both pink columns. This is the same task, it has the same task number, it is separated with 2 activities. There they are over there. Okay, we don't need the second oral mark, that's this one here, because we already have it over here, and we'll recreate. We don't need this mark here, which is this one here, which is the first part of task 3, because as I say, we'll recreate that mark in the formula build, and then all you need to do is enter the last 3 marks within that third task. Again, you can see that all 4 of these marks here, okay, are part of the third task, and as I mentioned already, that first part needn't be entered because we can recreate it in the formula itself. It's a calculated field in a sense, in other words, and so we only need to enter the last 3 marks within that third task. So again, as usual, basic rule of thumb, you're only entering marks where you need to enter marks, except in this case, and in other words, where marks have been pulled from other areas, you don't need to enter them, except, right, this is the exception for English grade 9, home language grade 9, and I'm going to briefly go through the Afrikaans ones too, to compare any differences. They generally tend to stay the same. You do have to enter the oral 1 mark from term 1, okay? And don't take my word for it that they're the same, by the way. I am going to double check and we'll go through any discrepancies. Generally, they tend to be the same. Okay, so that concludes this tutorial on comparing the mark sheet to the SAMS mark sheet. As I say, again, folks, just to recap, reiterate, you only have to enter marks into the first task there, the second task, your term 1 oral marks into the third column, ignore the 4th and 5th columns, and the last 3 marks of the third task. Again, that concludes this tutorial. There will be tutorials based on this tutorial showing the formula build, which is actually incredibly informative in terms of explaining why you capture into certain columns and not others.